In the silent, sprawling, mahogany-lined office, where the scent of aged paper and leather clung to the air like dust, old Mr. Elias Thorne, 82 years of age, and the patriarch of a multi-million-dollar empire, signed his last document. He didn't sign it with the steady hand of a successful man, but with the trembling grip of a man finally, irrevocably, setting fire to his own world. The document was his last will and testament, and its contents weren't merely shocking. They were a calculated 50-year-old act of betrayal against the very children who stood to inherit his name and his fortune. His decision was a deliberate, brutal, and ultimate lesson in what true family loyalty demands. A lesson taught not with words, but with the ruthless truth of his final legal act. This is the story of Elias Thorne, a man who, in his twilight years, chose to redefine what inheritance truly means. It is a terrifying chronicle of expectation, disappointment, and the profound wisdom that can only be forged across 8 decades of life, ambition, and quiet desperation. You are about to witness the unveiling of a secret held captive for 50 long years. The real reason an 82-year-old millionaire disinherited his own blood and left everything, the sprawling estate, the companies, the art collections, every single cent, to a complete stranger. The stranger was not his mistress, not a secret child, and not even a long-lost relative. She was just a name in a file, a figure from a past his children never knew existed, a person whose existence was the silent, aching proof of the family's biggest failure. By the time this story ends, you will know the single, unforgiving secret that Elias believed was worth more than his entire financial empire, and you will understand why his final act wasn't an ending, but the beginning of his true legacy. What you are about to see is not just a tale of money, but a terrifying lesson in the currency of the human heart, and how sometimes the only way to save a soul is to break a family. The consequences of this one signature are still unfolding today. Elias Thorne was a man built not of flesh and bone, but of granite ambition. Born in 1943, the shadow of the war and the scent of economic scarcity defined his youth. He grew up in the kind of quiet, working-class neighborhood where prosperity was not an expectation, but a fever dream. His father, a meticulous carpenter, had a simple philosophy. A man's worth is the sum of his savings. Elias internalized this, not as a philosophy, but as a survival mandate. By the time he was 18, his hands, though still young, carried the rigid stiffness of a man already focused on his grave, the grave he intended to fill with immense wealth. The conflict that would ultimately define his last will began not with his children, but with his relentless pursuit of the American dream. He didn't just chase wealth, he stalked it, sacrificing nearly everything to climb the corporate ladder. His marriage to Eleanor was less a union of passion and more a merger of compatible goals. Together, they built a life that appeared immaculate from the outside. 2 bright, well-mannered children, Arthur, the ambitious son, and Clara, the dutiful daughter, a mansion in the suburbs, and a reputation as philanthropists. But the perfection was a veneer, thin and easily shattered. Behind the closed doors of the Thorne estate, the air was perpetually cold, filled with the echoing silence of unexpressed needs. Elias gave his children everything material, the best schools, the finest cars, unconditional financial support. He gave them the gift of never having to want. But he never gave them the one thing they truly needed, his presence. His focus was always outward, always on the next deal, the next acquisition, the next million. This distance became the central corrosive conflict of his life. As Arthur and Clara grew, they saw their inheritance not as a blessing, but as an entitlement, a compensation for their father's perpetual absence. They learned early on that attention from Elias was transactional. measured in achievements and zeros in a bank account. They grew into adults who excelled at management, at appearances, and at spending, but who were fundamentally incapable of understanding empathy or unconditional sacrifice. Elias, watching them from his executive tower, saw two people he had created, but two people he barely knew. And as his health began to fade in his late 70s, the weight of his legacy began to crush him. He wasn't just worried about his money. He was terrified about the moral vacuum he would leave behind. He sought genuine connection, a whisper of real love, but found only polite inquiries about his portfolio and veiled suggestions for future investments. He realized then that he had failed not in building an empire, but in building a family. The stage was set for a dramatic, deeply personal reckoning, one that only a man with 82 years of accumulated regret could orchestrate. The journey that led Elias to his final act didn't start in the boardroom. It started in 1965, long before the children were born, with a woman named Sarah. Sarah was the antithesis of the world Elias was building. She was a nurse at the county hospital, a place smelling sharply of antiseptic and human vulnerability, a stark contrast to the clean lines of his ambition. Elias was 22, freshly out of business school, driven and utterly lost. He had been hospitalized briefly following a minor car accident, a humiliating pause in his ascent. Sarah was the young, kind-eyed nurse who looked beyond the stiff suit and saw the scared, lonely young man underneath. Her compassion, quiet and fierce, was the first unconditional kindness Elias had ever experienced. Their relationship was an anomaly, a secret world carved out between Elias's demanding schedule and Sarah's late shifts. She taught him the language of true care, a dialect spoken not with financial statements, but with soft hands and unwavering presence. It was Sarah who held his hand through the panic attacks that no one else knew he suffered. She was his confidant, his anchor, his fleeting glimpse of a different, simpler future. But Elias was caught in the gravitational pull of his own ambition. He saw Sarah's life as beautiful, yet too small, too financially precarious for the future he needed to forge. When Eleanor, the polished daughter of a major industrialist, presented herself as the key to the empire he craved, Elias made his pivotal, devastating choice. He chose gold over genuine warmth. He left Sarah abruptly, coldly, sending a check and a curt note, an act of transactional cruelty that he immediately buried deep within the bedrock of his success. The scent of antiseptic and regret, however, would linger in his memory, a subtle, haunting fragrance for the rest of his life. The first major twist, approx 20% of the story. What Elias never knew, what he never dared to ask, was that Sarah was pregnant when he left. She never cashed his check, never called, and never sought to interfere with the grand, cold life he was so desperate to build. Instead, she moved to a small town, raising their daughter, Lily, in the shadow of his silence, instilling in her the very values of self-sufficiency and unconditional care that Elias had rejected. Elias built his perfect fortress of wealth, completely unaware that the truest, kindest extension of his own blood was growing up hundreds of miles away, possessing the exact moral compass his legitimate children lacked. This hidden truth was the splinter in his soul, the unrecognized failure that would ultimately doom his meticulously planned legacy. The universe, in its quiet, merciless way, had ensured that the daughter he never met would one day become the judge of the children he had raised. The stage was now set for the most agonizing reunion of Elias's life. Decades passed in the gilded cage of the Thorne family life. Elias's wealth grew exponentially, but his inner solitude deepened. His children, Arthur and Clara, now in their 50s, were the very picture of inherited privilege, entitled, distant, and viewing their elderly father primarily as an asset manager. They never asked about his past, they only discussed their future. the future funded by his demise. The true turning point, the moment of shattering clarity for Elias, arrived not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet, sterile hospital room where his wife, Eleanor, was fading away. It was 2018. During Eleanor's final days, Elias sat by her bedside, holding a hand that had grown cold from disinterest decades ago. Arthur and Clara visited dutifully but briefly, their eyes constantly checking their phones, murmuring platitudes, eager to return to their own lives and their own comfort. The second major twist, approximately 50% of the story. One afternoon, a young, exhausted nurse came in to adjust Eleanor's IV. Her name was Lily. The moment Elias looked up, time dissolved. The curve of her cheekbone, the quiet competence in her eyes, the familiar, gentle way she handled the fragile body of his wife. It was an echo, a devastating phantom of Sarah, the woman he had abandoned 53 years prior. He watched Lily work for days. She didn't know who he was, beyond a grieving, wealthy widower, but Lily's care was total, unconditional, and deeply human. While his own children were haggling with the estate lawyer about tax strategies, Lily was sitting with Eleanor, reading poetry aloud, even though Eleanor was unconscious. It was an act of pure, selfless devotion to a stranger. Elias watched his son, Arthur, lose his patience over a 15-minute delay at the hospital valet, and then watched Lily stay an extra hour off the clock just to ensure Eleanor was comfortable. This contrast was the sacrifice Elias had to confront. He had sacrificed true human connection for ambition, and his children were the cold, brittle proof of that exchange. One evening, Elias finally spoke to her. He simply asked her name, Lily. He asked where she was from. She mentioned the small town where Sarah had moved. Every detail was a searing confirmation of the choice he had made half a century ago. This young woman, his unacknowledged daughter, was the living embodiment of the compassion and unconditional love that his wealth-addicted children had never known. In that hospital room, smelling of illness and impending finality, Elias realized his mistake was not just leaving Sarah, his mistake was letting ambition poison the very notion of love in his family line. The value was not in what he possessed, but in the moral emptiness of those he had raised to inherit it. He was now determined to use his last remaining power, his will, to correct a 60-year-old failure and teach his children the lesson of a lifetime, even if it meant breaking their hearts and his legacy in the process. He had to sacrifice their expectation of money to give them the only thing he truly had left, a piece of his lost truth. After Eleanor's funeral, a chilling formality attended by people concerned more with social standing than grief, Elias started the arduous process of rewriting his will. He employed a trusted, discreet lawyer who knew nothing of Sarah or Lily, instructing him only on the cold, hard facts of the dissolution of the Thorne estate. Elias was methodical, almost surgical, in his final design. He ensured Arthur and Clara received token, non-liquid assets, the old family photographs, the grandfather clock, a stark symbol that their inheritance was the sentimental detritus of a family they had never truly appreciated. The bulk of the fortune, everything of true monetary worth, was to be placed in an independent foundation, with a single crucial stipulation: the foundation's sole director, beneficiary, and executor would be Lily. The third major twist, approx. 80% of the story, the final crushing blow came not in the reading of the will, but in the accompanying sealed letter Elias left for his children. The lawyer, a man accustomed to conflict, delivered the news to Arthur and Clara in a sterile conference room. When the will's contents were revealed, the children's disbelief curdled into fury. Arthur roared about incompetence and legal challenges. Clara wept theatrically over the injustice. They demanded to know who this Lily was, this parasite who had stolen their birthright. It was then the lawyer presented the sealed letter from Elias. The letter did not contain an apology or an explanation for the money. Instead, it contained only a single, faded black-and-white photograph. A 22-year-old Elias, beaming, standing next to a young, vibrant nurse named Sarah, holding a newborn baby, Lily. The inscription on the back, written in Elias's spidery, aged script, was the final devastating lesson. The only thing you truly inherit is what you earn through sacrifice. I gave you everything material, and you earned nothing but distance. Lily earned this legacy through 50 years of unconditional kindness, a quality neither of you ever possessed. This is my true debt and your final lesson. The sheer, agonizing weight of this revelation was the leçon final. Elias's ultimate message was delivered from beyond the grave. Never mistake access for loyalty. He taught his family that while wealth can be transferred, character cannot. His advice, his ultimate wisdom for the viewer, is devastatingly simple, yet profound. Look not to what you are accumulating, but to what you are sacrificing for that accumulation. The value of your life is not in the zeros you collect, but in the genuine, unbought connections you cultivate. Fear not the loss of money, but the loss of human connection. Money can be rebuilt. Character once destroyed by greed is gone forever. Elias used his death and his fortune as a moral scalpel, cutting away the rot of entitlement he himself had cultivated, forcing his children to confront the profound poverty of their souls. This story is a direct mirror. Are you building a legacy of love, or merely a vault of gold? His 82 years taught him the only currency that matters is presence. The aftermath of Eleanor Thorne's will reading was a scene of devastating silence, far more impactful than any public spectacle. Arthur and Clara were not just disinherited, they were stripped bare of their lifelong illusion of worth. The money was gone, but the real pain was the realization that their father had judged them, not on their professional success, but on their fundamental lack of humanity. They were left with the knowledge that a stranger, their half-sister, was the only person who truly understood the meaning of selfless service, a quality that Elias had desperately sought in his final years. They were left not with an inheritance, but with an unforgiving mirror reflecting their own cold ambition. Lily, upon receiving the news, was bewildered, but used the foundation's funds exactly as Elias had hoped, channeling the wealth back into community healthcare, honoring the spirit of the mother Elias had left behind. Elias's final radical act continues to echo, a testament to the power of a life lived long enough to confront its own biggest mistake. The great lesson from Elias, the 82-year-old patriarch, is this: you can betray others, but the universe will always ensure you cannot betray your own truth. He spent a lifetime chasing the wrong metric of success, and in his final moments he sacrificed the illusion of his perfect family to resurrect the moral compass he lost 50 years ago. His betrayal of his children's expectation was, in fact, the final desperate act of love for them, forcing them to learn the one lesson he had failed to teach them while he was alive: the intrinsic value of being present. The emotional reflection, cliffhanger ending. Eleanor Thorne is gone, but the sound of his last signature, the sound of a world shattering, reverberates. Arthur and Clara are now forced to rebuild their lives, not from the bedrock of inherited wealth, but from the crumbling foundation of their own character. Will they learn the lesson? Will they finally understand that the greatest inheritance is the integrity you pass on, not the assets? We leave them standing in the shadow of their father's uncompromising judgment, facing a future stripped of comfort, forced to earn the respect they always believed was owed to them. And Lily, she holds the true legacy, the wisdom of Sarah, the heart Elias craved, and the financial power to prove that kindness, above all else, is the most profitable asset in the human experience. This story of the Thorne family is a brutal, honest look at legacy. It asks us, what currency are you collecting in your life, and who will you betray when it comes time to sign your final document? If this poignant and challenging story of legacy, loyalty, and the ultimate test of character has moved you, there are many more triumphs of wisdom and resilience awaiting you on the Triumph Stories. We are dedicated to sharing the profound life lessons learned across 80, 90, and 100 years. Show your support for the wisdom that truly matters by subscribing to our channel. The greatest inheritance we can all share is the knowledge gained from those who have lived the longest. The silence in the conference room after the reading of Elias's letter was so profound, so absolute, that Arthur and Clara could hear the distant, hollow clang of their entire future collapsing. The scent of their father's aged office, once comforting, the smell of success, of polished leather and ambition, now felt like the suffocating smell of judgment. Arthur, always the pragmatist, felt the sudden, shocking texture of the rug beneath his feet as he stumbled back, no longer solid ground but merely wool. Clara, clutching the framed photograph of her father and Sarah, could feel the cool, unforgiving glass against her trembling fingers, a cold contrast to the warmth she had always demanded, but never given. Their betrayal was not just a legal matter. It was a physical, sensory shock that stripped away their sense of entitlement. Meanwhile, Lily, the inadvertent recipient of this massive, complicated legacy, stood in the sterile light of her hospital ward, holding a copy of the foundation documents. For her, the experience was utterly different. The money felt abstract, almost meaningless. What resonated was the note that came with the photograph, a second, private confession from Elias to her, a single sentence of deep, decades-old regret. The metallic scent of blood and disinfectant that usually defined her workplace was now subtly overlaid with the dusty, poignant scent of old paper and the ghost of a mother's unspoken story. She accepted the funds not as a reward, but as a mandate, immediately restructuring the Thorne Foundation to focus on geriatric and palliative care, the very fields where she and her mother had dedicated their lives, and the very place where Elias finally found his humanity. This is where the story of Elias Thorne truly becomes our story. His life teaches us a crucial lesson about the sensory weight of our choices. When Elias was young, the sharp, cold scent of ambition blinded him to the warm, gentle texture of Sarah's hand. He valued the loud, booming echo of the boardroom over the quiet, soft-spoken wisdom of the hospital ward. His legacy is the devastating proof that the moral decay he allowed to infect his children was his own making. The betrayal was not leaving the money to Lily. The betrayal was failing to teach his children the value of a single, simple, honest moment. The sun sets now on the Thorne estate, its vast, shadowed windows overlooking the empty lawns. The place is silent, not with peace, but with the haunting quiet of a moral vacuum. Arthur and Clara are left to wander the corridors, haunted by the memory of a father they only saw as a wallet, and a sister they never knew existed. They have inherited the most painful thing of all, the realization that the life they spent planning for was merely a shadow, and the true, brilliant light of their father's final wisdom belongs to the kind-eyed nurse who chose service over self. This is the ultimate legacy lesson from a man who lived 82 years. Your final act is your truest confession. What will your confession be? If the profound emotional depth of Elias Thorne's story resonates with you, if it forces you to question the currency of your own life, we ask you to honor his lesson. Show your support by subscribing to the Triumph Stories. We are committed to sharing the painful, beautiful, and essential wisdom earned only through 8 decades of life. Subscribe now and help us turn the silence of an old man's regret into a loud, clear lesson for the world.